Distinguished delegates, I would like to call the meeting to order, please. Please take your chairs. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. I would like to call the meeting to order. Distinguished delegates, I would like to call the meeting to order. I invite delegates to their seats. Distinguished delegates, please take your chairs.
All right, maybe you can just start.
Distinguished delegates, welcome back. I hope you had a restful night. A very happy International Day for Biodiversity. We are very fortunate to be here in this hall in Nairobi, Kenya. As you all know, a historic event and decision has been taken in this place, in this hall. The text of the convention was adopted about 32 years back on 22nd May 1992. We are very fortunate to be here on this day, and let us dedicate ourselves to the conservation of biodiversity and for the health of planet and all people. Let me hand over to Secretariat to make some announcements, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. In that regard, we just wanted to bring to all delegates' attention that immediately following this session of plenary, there will be a special event to mark the International Day for Biodiversity. There will be a short event taking place here in this room, following which there will be lunch catered for all delegates in the courtyard adjoining us. So in that regard, we shall try to wrap up our work, at least for the morning session, in good time in order to change the seating on the podium. As I say, there'll be a short ceremonial event here, and then we'll move outside. Before we proceed, I would just like to remind all delegates, firstly, to please upload their statements, their written statements, as soon as possible, ideally in advance of making that statement to assist our interpretation. And in that regard, also to remember to speak slowly when you're making your interventions. The time is always going to be tight, but try to resist the temptation of speeding up your spoken interventions, because it makes it very difficult for the interpreters. So I think that's all I wanted to say, Dr. Reddy, and I hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Neil. We will now finish consideration of agenda item 3, mechanisms for planning, monitoring, and review. When we closed yesterday, I said I would outline the way forward to advance the item and also hear 3 remaining statements from IPLCs, women and youth, who had requested the floor. I understand also that one party, Fiji, had requested the floor earlier, but that its request had dropped off the list. Just to advise that, if that happens again, please press your button again to restore yourself to the list. Therefore, I will now invite Fiji to deliver its statement. Fiji, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Happy International Day for Biological Diversity. Chair, Fiji welcomes the documents, mechanism for planning, monitoring, reporting, and review, and the global report and terms of reference for the ad hoc scientific and technical advisory group for preparation of the global report. An effective, robust, and responsive mechanism for planning, monitoring, reporting, and review is key to achieving the targets of Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Fiji believes that the global review should be a robust process which includes a series of technical steps to analyze progress on implementation of KMGBF and assess whether aggregated national actions are on track to achieve the mission global goals and targets. High-level commitment from state leaders will be essential to the global review process towards strengthening actions and efforts, including on the provision of adequate, sustainable, and easily accessible means of implementation to developing country parties. We welcome technical and financial support to countries to meet its reporting deadlines. In response to the outcome of the global review process, COP17 and COP19, this should provide guidance to parties on ways to improve actions and increase efforts at the national level. The final decision of the global review should take into consideration and include the contributions of non-state actors towards GBF implementation so that the global review of the progress allows for standardized, participatory, practical, and impactful review from both state and non-state actors. The global review must lead to an improvement of actions and efforts by parties, including on the provision of adequate means of implementation to address any gaps in the implementation of KMGBF that are identified. Chair, Fiji will submit our specific text proposal for the draft recommendation on the procedures for the global review to the Secretariat in writing and looking forward to constructive discussions on the specific item here in Nairobi. We thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Fiji. Now I will move to IPLCs. You have the floor, please. Please limit your statements to 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. On agenda item 3, the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity believes that contributions of rights holders and stakeholders to planning, monitoring, reporting, and review are important for whole-of-society approaches. There are notable gaps in documents SBI 4/4 and SBI 4/2 in terms of reflecting community-based monitoring and information systems and citizen science consistent with COP Decision 5.5, inviting parties to recognize and support these complementary sources of data. IAFB recommends the strengthening of evidence-based reporting through the inclusion of community-based data and information in the preparation of national reports, in the compilation of the global review and report, and in the online reporting tool. IAFB reiterates its commitment to produce the 3rd edition of Local Biodiversity Outlooks, illustrating the contributions of indigenous peoples and local communities to the implementation of the Kunming to Montreal Biodiversity Plan as a complementary publication to the global report. We have some proposals to strengthen SBI 4/4, including in the introduction, the recommendations in Annex 1 and 2. In the introduction, paragraph 22, the monitoring of commitments of non-state actors is considered optional. IAFB proposes that reporting on such commitments are very important and should be included in the template for national reporting in Annex 1, giving due attention to reporting modalities for non-state actors. In the recommendations, paragraph 4, add additional and self-determined commitments. Paragraph 10C, add consideration of the goals, targets, and cross-cutting considerations of the framework. Add a new subparagraph 10E, data and information provided by indigenous peoples, local communities, women, and youth, including the contributions of collective actions to the implementation of the KMGBF, such as a future edition of local biodiversity outlooks. In para 15, add a new subparagraph 5E bis to support the preparation of the next edition of local biodiversity outlooks, indigenous peoples and local communities' contributions to the implementation of the KMGBF. In paragraph 16, add local and including community-based monitoring and information. In Annex 1, Section 1, add indigenous peoples, local communities, women, and youth. In Annex 1, Section 2, add all sections of the KMGBF. In Annex 1, Section 2, on the responses to the question, did your country involve and engage stakeholders in revising or updating its NBSAP, include a comment box where details can be elaborated. In Annex 1, Section 3, add an additional row with the text, please briefly describe the use of multiple data and information sources, including from community-based monitoring, in the compilation of the national report. In the same Section 3, add an additional row with the text, please briefly describe the contributions of non-state actors in the implementation of the NBSAPs. In Annex 1, Section 5, in the box, add and cross-cutting considerations contained in Section C. In the enclosure, add and other plans adopted by the Convention, such as the Plan of Action on Customary Sustainable Use. In Annex 2, Paragraph 1C, add collective actions are after the word commitments. The detailed recommendations, including the introduction, are submitted to the Secretariat. We would please seek party support for these recommendations. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, IPLCs. Now, I would like to seek from the parties or party, if they support the amendments changes proposed by the IPLCs, please raise your hands.
Egypt and European Union.
Thank you for your support to the changes suggested by the IPLCs. I thank the parties. Next, the CBD Women's Caucus, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm speaking on behalf of the CBD Women Caucus. The CBD Women Caucus reiterates the importance of a whole-of-society and whole-of-government approach in the planning, monitoring, reporting, and review of the GBF. This is in alignment with consideration Section C of the GBF and the application of a human rights-based approach, including advancing a gender-responsive and inclusive process recognizing the past, present, and future contributions of indigenous people and local communities, women, youth, and others to the GBF. In this regard, we suggest the following addition to the document CBD SBI/4/4. In the introduction, para 1, add reference to decision 15/11. In Para 2, Subpara G, add contributions after commitments when referring to non-state actors, and do so consistently throughout the document, including in Annex 2, Para 7 and 8. In recommendations, Para 10, add Subpara E bis, information on non-state actor commitments and contributions towards the GBF. Para 15, Subpara B, add, after two further development mechanisms, including appropriate guidance and technical support to indigenous people, local communities, women and youth for their participation in the reporting of commitments of their contribution. In Annex 1, Section 3, about question for the binary indicators, we recommend deleting optional in the comment for indicators that have binary indicators but have no headline indicators. Section 5, add a separate section at the end to provide a summary assessment of the implementation of Section C of the framework. In Annex 2, Para 9, add, after the constituent organization, or in case of commitments or contribution of indigenous people and local communities, endorsement should also be done by traditional authorities as relevant. Add 9 bis, in the case of commitments or contributions related to traditional knowledge, reporting should include compliance with free and prior informed consent. Regarding document addendum 2, in section 1, add subpara summary of outputs from the report of the non-state actor commitments and contribution to the GBF. In section 2, add subpara E, oversee the processes established for non-state actors' voluntary reporting, which include the reporting of information on non-state actor commitments and contribution. We would like to seek party support for our recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, CBD Women's Caucus. Now, floor is open for the parties. Anybody would like to support changes, amendments proposed by the CBD Women's Caucus? Please raise your hands. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the support. Thank you, CBD Women's Caucus. Now, next in line, youth. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and happy Biodiversity Day. I'm speaking on behalf of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. Youth are already making key contributions to implementation of the GBF, from mangrove restoration projects in Kenya, policy trainings in Southeast Asia, agroecology projects in Bolivia, working with school children in Morocco and Sri Lanka, biodiversity and climate education in Thailand, and many more. Youth actions are many, diverse, and guided by values that are in harmony with nature. These contributions, despite bringing us closer to reaching the targets, become invisible without appropriate ways to count, recognize, and report on them. These must be counted in national reports, and parties should establish or improve mechanisms to officially receive youth and other contributions for consideration in their reporting process. We take note of the annex on non-state actor commitments reporting and see the value of simple, standardized guidelines and templates to facilitate global-level analysis, to capture the collective commitments and contributions of youth and other actors in the way and form that they want. We call for openness to also recognize and consider other methods of non-state actor reporting in addition to the action agenda towards a multiple evidence-based approach, especially as we move towards the global review process. Regarding the global review process, there is a need to ensure full and effective participation of indigenous peoples and local communities, women and youth throughout the process, and ensure we are represented in the relevant advisory bodies. Regarding the elements of the global review, we have text proposals in line with ensuring that reports developed by indigenous peoples and local communities, women and youth themselves, can be considered as an element of the global review, complementary to the global report. First, we would add a subparagraph E bis to paragraph 10 on the global review elements. This paragraph would read, reports developed by indigenous peoples and local communities, women and youth on their contributions to implementation, such as a future edition of the local biodiversity outlooks and similar reports. To encourage support for these, after paragraph 15, we propose to add a paragraph that reads, encourages parties, financial institutions, and other relevant organizations to support initiatives of indigenous peoples and local communities, women and youth in documenting their contributions to implementation with
if they support anything. Okay, thank you, Egypt and Philippines. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the support, and thank you GYBN, thank you youth. We have now concluded our first reading on item 3, agenda item 3. Thank you all delegates for your very useful and constructive comments and suggestions. On many issues, I note significant convergence. However, there are some aspects where there are differences of opinion and further discussion is required. I will therefore establish a contact group that will be co-chaired by Ms. Gillian Guthrie of Jamaica and Ms. Carolina Cáceres of Canada. I thank them for accepting this responsibility. The mandate of the contact group will be to deliberate elements of the draft of recommendations, focusing on matters related to global review, as well as aspects on open-ended forum, and also addressing aspects of the reporting template for non-state actors. I will prepare a non-paper for this. The contact group will meet this evening and the Secretariat will announce the room shortly. Before we proceed to item 4, I would like to give the floor to Secretary. Secretary, please, you have the floor.
Good morning, colleagues and delegates, distinguished delegates. Yesterday, we heard a number of countries interested in using the online reporting tool and wish to have some training. I just want to inform you tomorrow night in conference room 9, there will be a side event organized by Secretariat on the tools, particularly on the online reporting tool. And also the Secretariat also set up a help desk in the corridor between this room and conference room 1. And if you have questions on the use of the online reporting tool, you can come anytime. And also the Secretariat is going to organize 2 mini training at the help desk on the May 24th and the May 27th during the lunchtime. You're most welcome to join. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretariat. Distinguished delegates, we will now take up agenda item 4. Under this item, we will first take up sub-item 4A, resource mobilization, and then 4B, financial mechanisms. Starting with resource mobilization, I would first like to invite the co-chairs of the Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilization, Ms. Ines Verlier and Mr. Patrick Luna, to brief the subsidiary body. Ms. Verlier, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On behalf of my co-chair, Patrick Luna, and myself, it is my pleasure to brief the SBI on the work of the Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilization. The committee was established by COP15 and is composed of 64 members, 43 nominated by parties and other governments, and 21 by relevant organizations, stakeholders, and community groups, ensuring regional and gender balance. The Secretariat communicated the selection process and committee composition in early 2023. Further to an online organizational meeting in September 2023, the first in-person meeting took place in Kinshasa, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, also in September 2023. At that meeting, the committee had initial discussions on the elements of its mandate and agreed on a work plan on how to deliver them. The committee then convened 4 times in a virtual setting between November 2023 and February 2024 to further advance discussions. Our second in-person meeting took place in Villa de Leyva, Colombia, from March 18 to 22, 2024. We would like to express our sincere appreciation to the DRC and Colombia for hosting the committee meetings, as well as to the EU and to the UK for the contributions that made them possible. And we would like to express our gratitude to all the members of the committee for their hard work on these challenging topics and for their spirit of collaboration and of seeking mutual understanding. We also thank the Secretariat for their support to the committee. Let me now turn to the substantive part of our report. The recommendations prepared by the committee are contained in the annex of the SBI 4 document on resource mobilization, CBD SBI 4/5, in the form of elements of a draft decision. I would like to highlight that these elements were developed to provide a basis for further work by the SBI. The draft decision, including its 3 annexes, seeks to reflect the various views expressed by committee members in a balanced manner, but it does not necessarily reflect individual comments made by members in their entirety, nor does it reflect the consensus within the committee. In short, what the committee aimed to achieve with the draft decision is providing the SBI with the best possible basis for its own work. With your indulgence, Mr. Chairman, I would yield the floor to my fellow co-chair for the second part of this report. Thank you.
Mr. Patrick Luna, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you will recall, Decision 15/7 tasked the committee with 3 different tasks. Our first task relates to the review of the strategy for resource mobilization, more precisely its second phase, that is, period 2025-2030. Considering that COP16 has been asked to fully align the strategy with the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework and other relevant decisions adopted at COP15, the committee prepared elements for an upgraded strategy, which are contained in Annex 1 of the draft decision. Our second task was to explore the current finance landscape with a view to assessing gaps and overlaps and to identify opportunities to strengthen, simplify, and reform existing instruments. The committee considered a landscape study prepared by the Secretariat and then prepared a non-exhaustive list of voluntary actions to strengthen, simplify, and reform existing instruments for biodiversity finance, which is then contained in Annex 2 of the draft decision. Our third task was to explore proposals for a global instrument on biodiversity finance to mobilize resources from all sources, commensurate to the ambition of the KMGBF. This debate was guided by 3 questions. contained in Decision 15/7 itself. 1. Whether to create a dedicated financing mechanism for the Convention under the authority of the COP, which could be designated Global Biodiversity Fund, and what the options are to operationalize it. 2. Whether the trust fund under the GEF, established by Decision 15/15, should be designated Global Biodiversity Fund. And 3. Whether and how either of these two funding mechanisms or another one would be the adequate entity to receive and disperse the revenue generated by the mechanism established under Decision 15/9, that is, by DSI. The committee converged on the understanding that further in-depth discussions would be helpful to prepare informed answers to questions 1 and 2. For this reason, the draft decision contains a recommendation to establish an open-ended, intergovernmental, and inclusive process, which would be informed by the criteria enshrined in Articles 20 and 21 of the Convention, and could further be informed by the elements contained in Annex 3 of the draft decision. Regarding the third question, which relates to the revenue generated by the DSI mechanism, the committee understood that it would not be in a position to develop its response without taking into consideration the work of the open-ended working group on digital sequence information on genetic resources. For this reason, the committee recommends that the SBI allow it to hold a third meeting after the second meeting of the DSI working group. The committee would then make full use of its mandate contained in paragraph 43 of Decision 15/7 and report directly to COP16. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Patrick Luna, Ms. Ines Verle, for your presentation of the report. Thank you, co-chairs, for that informative briefing. As a member of the advisory committee, I can testify to the great work you have done in guiding the committee, and on behalf of the subsidiary body, I would like to offer our sincere appreciation. In addition, on behalf of the subsidiary body, I would like to thank all the committee members for their hard work, and especially the governments of Democratic Republic of the Congo and the Colombia for hosting the meetings of the committee. I would now like to invite the Secretariat to introduce the documents, please. Secretariat, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, delegates. Now, on this item, you will have before you, and that's further to the debrief just provided by the co-chairs, a package of 3 documents. So the pre-session document 4/5, it summarizes the work undertaken to pursuant of the decision of the last COP, Decision 15/7 on resource mobilization, and it provides in the annex the draft recommendation prepared by the advisory committee, as just explained. Then information document 10 provides and this document has been prepared by the Secretariat to facilitate the work of the advisory committee, and I am pleased to report of the second meeting of the advisory committee on resource mobilization. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretariat, for that introduction. I will now open the floor. I encourage all interventions to be concise and focused on concrete suggestions. I encourage parties speaking on behalf of a regional group to request the floor early. In this regard, I would like to mention that those who want to speak on behalf of regional groups, please come forward, and thereafter only the floor will be open for the parties. Yesterday, one party has come to me and suggested there is some confusion in that. Therefore, I would like to complete first the regional group's presentation. Statements made on regional groups may be up to 5 minutes. Statements by individual groups may be limited to 3 minutes, please. Now I open the floor for the only regional groups to take the floor. So the first in the list is, here I could see Zimbabwe.
Thank you, Chairperson. Zimbabwe makes this statement on behalf of the Africa Group. Africa appreciates the progress made on the implementation of Decision 15.7 on resource mobilization and the work of the Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilization during the intersessional period. We also appreciate the support and contributions of several parties and international organizations and the Secretariat. Chair, the transformative change Africa wants to see to bend the curve for biodiversity loss needs resources. We have a firm resolve that it is possible to change the current trajectories. However, expecting such change without closing the financing gap renders the GBF goals and targets wishful thinking. Africa is deeply concerned with the slow progress on Target 19 on increasing the level of financial resources in an effective, timely, and easily accessible manner. We hoped to see increase in the total biodiversity-related international financial resources from developed countries to at least 20 billion United States dollars per year by 2025, and to at least $30 billion per year by 2030. But this is still a dream. Perhaps we need a tracking tool for this, Chair. Africa appreciates the draft report produced on the finance landscape study, and we note the gaps as well as the opportunities to reform the existing cocktail of instruments with the aim of strengthening the current finance landscape for biodiversity. It is important, Chair, that we take the necessary steps to effectively address the gaps identified, and this is why Africa believes establishment of the Global Finance Fund, Biodiversity Fund, which is a dedicated finance mechanism for the CBD under the authority of the Conference of the Parties at the next COP in October this year is very important. Chair, we already lost a lot of time on this matter, and postponement of that important decision to COP17 might also mean further delays in the discussions that we could already start at COP16 until the fund is operationalized. The existing finance mechanism ratified and launched at the Global Environment Facility's 7th Assembly is appreciated. And we also recognize the efforts being made to capitalize these funds for the 9th replenishment period. However, it is still very limited to facilitate the effective implementation of the GBF. The fact that no project proposals were received from the eligible countries to support implementation of the Cartagena Protocol under the existing finance mechanism is an indicator of the prohibiting complexity, making it difficult for parties to access their allocations under the programming directions of the 8th replenishment of JEF. On the other hand, only 2 project proposals were processed under the Nagoya Protocol, indicating low uptake. We also believe this mechanism, of course, is only an interim arrangement with reference to Article 39 of the Convention. Africa welcomes the revised draft resource mobilization strategy, as it will give us a firm basis to guide parties and supporting partners on mobilization of resources commensurate with the ambition of the GBF. We are also supporting the proposed extension of the mandate of the Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilization to convene a meeting after SBI4 so that reflections from the open-ended working group on DSI can be taken into consideration before the next COP. Africa strongly believes benefit sharing from DSI remains a critical part of resource mobilization. We are ready to engage further and contribute more specific editorial amendments in the contact group that will be established for this important item. Africa believes in the potential of our collective capacity to seize emerging opportunities and galvanizing governments and all of society into taking concrete action on resource mobilization and closing the financing gap for Africa, Chair. Scaling up resource mobilization efforts and having a finance mechanism is an imperative which was part of the deal in Montreal. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Zimbabwe, for speaking on behalf of African Regional Group. On the screen, I could see Jamaica, Egypt, European Union, Cuba. Whether or not they speak on regional group or on behalf of party, now I would like to go as per the list on the screen, otherwise there will be again dropping off and there could be some problems. So Jamaica, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The extent to which developing country parties will effectively implement their commitments under this convention will depend on the effective implementation by developed country parties of their commitments under this convention related to financial resources and transfer of technology. The sentence I just read is not just GRULAC's opinion. It is actually an excerpt from Article 20 of the convention text. As we begin our work on resource mobilization, GRULAC reiterates that Article 20 and 21 of the Convention, along with other relevant provisions such as Article 39, constitute a legal framework binding us all and quantified in Target 19 of the GBF. These provisions also remind us of the spirit of cooperation and solidarity that inspired the adoption of our convention more than 3 decades ago and that urgently needs to be revived. Mr. Chair, since COP15, GRULAC countries have been making their best efforts to advance in the implementation of the convention and to contribute to the achievement of the goals and targets of the GBF. For this, we have received cooperation from our partners, be it through bilateral channels or multilateral entities such as the GEF and its GBFF. But the level of financing is just not enough. We are left wondering what could have been achieved for global biodiversity if only the financial targets were met. We acknowledge that some progress has been made, but we are deeply frustrated with the abysmal gap between reality and the Target 19A figures. As per the current situation, governments from developed countries should increase their support to fulfill their commitments to developing countries of US $20 billion per year by 2025 and US $30 billion per year by 2030. Of course, developed countries can mobilize financial resources through different mechanisms, not just the GEF and its GBFF. But the level of financing made available under these mechanisms is a relevant indicator. Within GEF 8, only US $480 million per year was devoted to biodiversity. Less than US $50 million was available for the first call for projects and approximately US $70 million for the second call under the GBFF. These figures are clear. A continuation of current trends will leave us woefully short of the objectives of Target 19A. And as Article 20 reminds us, the insufficiency of cooperation and solidarity inevitably has an impact on the much-needed actions to effectively implement the Convention. Some will remind us of the role of the private sector and of philanthropy in mobilizing international resources. While we agree that we should tap into all available sources of financing, we should also have a clear understanding of what each of these sources can and cannot do. In terms of scale and predictability, for instance, there are no substitutes for the responsibility of developed countries in relation to financing as per the Convention text. The insufficiency of financial resources made available to assist developing countries to implement their commitments under the Convention is particularly felt in the countries that are home to most of the world's biodiversity. Countries like those in our regions that bear a high burden in protecting biodiversity, their voices should count much more than it currently does in the GEF and the GBFF governance systems. We have been and we will continue to call for GEF effectiveness assessments. This does not prejudice the call by some GRULAC countries to address a separate and pressing issue, which is the outstanding mandate contained in Article 21 to establish a dedicated fund under the authority of the COP. In the past, the point has been made that creating a new fund requires a long process, and that urgency of the biodiversity crisis requires immediate action. Today, we find ourselves in a unique historical junction. Since the GBFF has been created to address our immediate needs, we have until 2030, its sunset date, to define which mechanism will continue to support the implementation of the CBD and its GBF, one that GRULAC would hope would be designed in a truly inclusive and innovative way, learning from the experience of current instruments and crucially elevating the visibility of biodiversity in the overall environmental finance landscape. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jamaica, for speaking on behalf of GRULAC. Now, I would proceed to European Union. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm speaking on behalf of the EU and its member states. Let me start by expressing our appreciation to the Advisory Committee for Reduced Mobilization, its two co-chairs, and to all ACRM members for the positive and constructive approach to its work and the good atmosphere in which we conducted it. Also highlight the contribution that was made by stakeholders and rights holders and international organizations to the work of this committee. Mr. Chairman, the EU and its member states strongly welcome the Global Biodiversity Framework, including its resource mobilization targets and the resource mobilization strategy, and remain committed to mobilizing resources from all sources in support of the implementation of the GBF. Let me say that as far as our efforts are concerned, we are on track to meet our commitments under Target 19. We would support inviting the ICRM to reconvene in person after the second meeting of the Working Group on DSI in order to finalize its work under this part of its mandate regarding DSI and to report thereon to the COP16. The EU and its member states welcome the draft revised strategy for resource mobilization and in general think that the proposed changes improve its alignment with the GBF and reflect a transformative but balanced approach. We have, however, some amendments to propose in view of its adoption. Overall, we consider it important that the strategy continues to ensure a good balance between the international finance flows part and other elements and would like to see the sections on harmful flows appear more prominently. We question if a placeholder for the outcome of discussions on the global instruments held at COP16 is appropriate at this time, as in our view these discussions cannot come to any clear conclusion at this matter at COP16. Given that the strategy is a flexible framework with a focus on implementation, we propose to delete this paragraph. We acknowledge that the non-exhaustive list of voluntary actions in Annex 2 may have value, and based on the premise that this is non-exhaustive and voluntary, would merely propose to add some actions we feel are missing. In case those actions in the list were further discussed, we would also have proposals to improve them. We appreciate the efforts by the GEF to review and improve the current project cycle of its trust funds as requested by COP15. We also welcome the swift and successful response to the request by COP15 to launch the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund, and we also welcome the contributions made to the capitalization of the GBFF by several donor countries, including Canada, Germany, UK, Spain, Japan, and Luxembourg. We also noted the many positive comments on the work of, under the GF and the GBFF that we have already heard in the discussions in this meeting of the SBI. We welcome that the GBFF is open to receive funding from all sources and would like the draft recommendation to call on all relevant actors to contribute to the funding. In that context, we would also like to call on all governments that are in the position to do so to shoulder their responsibilities and also contribute to the mobilization of international biodiversity funding. In the document, we would like to delete the reference to the contribution made to the GBFF so far, as this amount is subject to change and does not appear to be detrimental to the GBFF's activities. The EU and its member states welcome the exploration of the biodiversity finance landscape prepared by the Secretariat contained in document IV10. This document provides useful information on ongoing efforts by parties, other governments, as well as relevant stakeholders, organizations, and initiatives at all levels for biodiversity finance. While closing the gap remains challenging, we note that the 2025 target is within reach and would like to see that reflected, and we would see it reflected in the document that there are positive trends in biodiversity finance. We'd also like to ask for intersessional work about best practices and lessons learned on the implementation of the GBF in respect of resource mobilization. First, we would like to see a study on how the guidance on safeguards in biodiversity finance mechanisms adopted by decisions 12/3 and 14/15 has been implemented. Secondly, we would like to propose that the platform is integrated into the clearinghouse mechanisms in line with the knowledge management strategies, allowing parties and observers to exchange on this, in particular on the implementation of Goal D and targets 14, 15, 18, and 19, as well as the resource mobilization strategy. It is evident, however, that the work carried out has not identified any element that would support the need for a dedicated global instrument outside of the existing funding structures. The EU and its member states take the view that we should focus efforts on the implementation of the GBF, including its goals and targets related to resource mobilization, and on working with existing funding structures. We therefore don't see added value in further discussions on a new instrument and therefore propose to delete Annex 3. Should other parties see the need to continue the discussion following COP16, exploring the need for and the feasibility of a dedicated global instrument on biodiversity finance to mobilize resources from all sources, such a discussion should not be prejudicial to possible outcomes, in particular one that would lead to the establishment of a new fund, and we think it does not require the establishment of a dedicated process. Mr. Chairman, we do have amendments and changes to the draft documents, which we have submitted for further consideration. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, European Union.
Could the chair...
You have the floor, please. I would like to ask two regional groups, any party would like to speak on behalf of Asia Pacific and Central and Eastern Europe. If there is none, we will proceed with the parties. Thank you. Egypt, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Egypt supports the statement presented by Zimbabwe on item 4 on behalf of the African group. Egypt highlights that it's important to ensure that the market-based finance solution proposed by the strategy do not cause negative impact on biodiversity and human rights. Recent evidence from carbon and biodiversity offset, for example, shows that they do not improve biodiversity outcome and may negatively affect indigenous people and local communities. These issues were highlighted in the exploratory study on the biodiversity finance landscape. We propose the following amendment in the document CBD/SBI/4/5. Page 8.6 to add to the end, including an assessment of the impact of innovative finance solution on biodiversity and human rights. Page 9 to add the following 14 best to include some studies recommended by the member of the Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilization. To read as follows: 14 best request the Executive Secretary, subject to the availability of financial resource, to commission or undertake the following study. A, on how the guidance on safeguarding biodiversity finance mechanism adopted by decision 12/3 and 14/15 has been implemented, identifying good practice and lessons learned, as well as opportunities for improving implementation of the guidance. B, on the relationship between the sovereign debt and the implementation of the convention, and on the possibility of rechanneling specific rolling right for the biodiversity finance. C, on the lesson learned from the governance of different financial mechanisms and their grievance mechanism, and on the synergy between biodiversity and climate change. Page 11, at the end of point I and 2I, to add by the end of the phrase, while monitoring and assessing the impact on biodiversity, gender equality, and human rights, and to add and scaling up support for such action and approach at the end of point H. Page 12.6b to delete starting from using such framework till the end of the phrase. Page 13 to add while monitoring and assessing their impact on biodiversity, gender equality, and human rights, and at the end of point 8C and 8D. Also to add effectively applying environmental and social safeguard at the end of point 8F, and delete starting from using such framework till the end of the phrase in point 9C. Mr. Chair, we will submit those proposals in our submission. Thank you.
Thank you, Egypt. Democratic Republic of Congo, you have the floor, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chair, for giving me the floor yet again. Now, we make this statement, sir, and we ask it to be added to the records of this meeting. The DRC wishes to reaffirm and back the statement made by Zimbabwe on behalf of Africa. The DRC, with its 155 million hectares of forests, represents 10% of the tropical rainforests of the world and 62% of the forests of the Congo River Basin, which is today recognized as one of the first lungs of this planet in terms of carbon sequestration. And we have a number of projects in a number of areas of the country. We thus play a leading role in achieving the objectives of the convention. It is for this reason that the DRC is going to host in Kinshasa from the 3rd to the 5th of June 2024 the 20th meeting of the parties to the Partnership for the Congo River Basin Forests. Kinshasa, capital of the DRC, also enjoyed the honor and the privilege of hosting from the 25th to the 29th of September 2023 the first meeting of the Advisory Committee on the Mobilization of Resources. This reaffirms the commitment of the DRC to contribute in an effective way to achieving our objectives. Sir, the DRC welcomes the reforms which were initiated by the GBFF and the creation of the fund for the GBFF. This was a compromise at COP15 in Montreal. To remind you, it is since 2019 in Rome that we started to ring the alarm bells regarding the need to create a special dedicated global fund for biodiversity in keeping with Articles 20 and 21 of the Convention. It has been 5 years now that we have engaged in interesting exchanges regarding this proposal. The DRC cannot, under any condition, accept a postponing of this very important decision, which creates a special fund dedicated to biodiversity under the authority of the Conference of the Parties. This fund is to be created by COP16 and no later than this, as it is aimed at bolstering the efforts carried out by the GF this far. The DRC discourages any attempts to transform the GEF into a special fund dedicated for biodiversity as stated in Article 21 of the Convention. We remind you that the GEF under Article 39 of the Convention is a temporary provisional mechanism. Acting in another way would be undermining and violating the relevant provisions of the Convention and is fraught with the risk of undermining the implementation of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Where there is a will, there is a way. By way of conclusion, the DRC requests the creation by COP16 of the GBFF and the setting up of a working group, an open-ended working group to determine the modalities for the operationalization and functioning of this fund. I thank you.
Thank you. Democratic Republic of Congo. I would like to announce the names of the parties in queue. Seychelles, Venezuela, South Africa. Seychelles, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Seychelles supports the statement made by Zimbabwe on behalf of Africa. Seychelles welcomes document SBI/4/5 on resource mobilization. The draft recommendation by the Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilization is a good basis to develop recommendations for consideration of the COP at its 16th meeting. We also welcome all 3 annexes of the document as a basis for discussion. Mr. Chair, a highly ambitious KMGBF requires more than adequate resources to ensure effective implementation of the KMGBF and at national level, the MBSAPs. Target 19 of the KMGBF calls upon substantially and progressively increasing the level of financial resources from all sources. Seychelles is considered as a biodiversity hotspot. However, over the years, we have seen a reduction in our ability to access international funding to support our national priorities for biodiversity. This has also impacted some of our partners, including NGOs that is managing protected areas, including areas of global importance. Therefore, at national level, we had to find innovative financing solutions to support our national priorities for biodiversity. Seychelles is also in the process of revising its biodiversity finance plan to be in alignment with the updated MBSAP. Nevertheless, with all the efforts to mobilize funding at national level, Seychelles is still a small island developing state with a small, fragile economy and vulnerable to external shocks. Furthermore, we are limited in our capacity. There is still a need for international funding to support and complement national efforts. Therefore, in line with Article 20 of the Convention and emphasizing on Target 19A, calling upon international financial resources from developed countries, including official development assistance, and from countries that voluntarily assume obligations of developed country parties, to developing countries, in particular, the least developed countries and small island developing states, as well as countries with economies in transition. We are nearing 2025, and until now, the level of commitments has been minimal, and we urge developed countries to fulfill its obligation to provide new and additional financial resources. In line with this, there is a need to track these international funding commitments to ensure transparency and accountability. But with this, we welcome the establishment of the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund by the GEF. However, it is still premature to indicate the level of success of the new fund and the disbursement of funding to all eligible parties. A proper analysis and review of the fund will be required. We take note of the biodiversity finance landscape study and the different opportunities and gaps identified through the study. There must be ongoing work to continuously understand and explore the biodiversity finance landscape. Moreover, there is a need to address the identified gaps from the study. We cannot digress the discussion for a dedicated global instrument for biodiversity finance and urges that this discussion occurs in the immediate, in line with Article 21 and in reference to Article 39 of the Convention. Lastly, countries require capacity building and technical expertise to identify and implement new financing solutions at national level, and also to build capacity to access international funding. Mr. Chair, there is a need for comprehensive, fair, inclusive, and equitable access to all financing resources by all eligible parties, stakeholders, and rights holders, as means to halt the loss of biodiversity. We remain committed to further engage on this agenda item. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Seychelles. The parties in the queue are Venezuela, South Africa, Nigeria. Venezuela, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela supports the statement made by Jamaica on behalf of GRULAC. We welcome the work that's been carried out by the group of experts in preparing this document. We recognize the urgent necessity to look at the issue of biodiversity and the degradation of ecosystems, and we reiterate our undertaking to contribute to the implementation of the KMGBF. We would like to know that we have to have sufficient funds so we're able to deal with the 23 targets that have been identified. As a megadiverse country and developing country, we call on to look at the CBDR and to agree with Target 19 of the KMGBF. And the fund is far from what was established, and in that target, the financial resources and technology transfer are fundamental for us to be able to achieve our aims. Mr. Chair, we should work urgently and have proper financial commitment, and it's important to have such a mechanism. However, if we do not have the willingness of the donors, then the achievement of the common but differentiated responsibilities will be very difficult for those countries which are developing and represent a major issue in terms of biodiversity itself. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Venezuela. South Africa, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. South Africa supports the statement made by Zimbabwe on behalf of the Africa Group. South Africa appreciates and acknowledges the work of the ACRM on the development of a strategy, the landscape study, and inputs towards the global financial instrument for biodiversity. We note that now more than ever before, the need for scaly resource mobilization efforts and the overdue establishment of a financial mechanism is now more pronounced. South Africa would like to reiterate its support for the establishment of the Global Biodiversity Fund under the control of the COP at COP16, and that the operationalization process and other related matters has to be dealt with through a process to be determined by the COP. Such a decision cannot be postponed, and therefore South Africa will support an intergovernmental process that is inclusive and transparent to be established by the COP for the immediate operationalization of the Global Biodiversity Fund. Further, South Africa would like to advance the following reasons on why we need this dedicated Global Biodiversity Fund. Firstly, it is provided for in the Convention on Biological Biodiversity, especially in Articles 20 and 21, and until now there has been no special fund dedicated to biodiversity. The existing mechanism under Article 9, as we all know, is provisional. The existing mechanism, as we know, is interim and is limited and only aims to facilitate the implementation of the KMGBF and is not sufficient to address the gap. Therefore, South Africa, as aligned with Africa, is still adamant that the establishment of this fund is long overdue. Thirdly, that there's still a huge finance gap to be filled, which shows that the existing mechanisms are not adequate, and therefore the GBFF under GEF will never be able to fill the finance gap to implement the convention, its protocols, and even the GBF in itself. As aligned with Africa, we are in favor of this dedicated GBF, and we believe that the trajectory defined in Decision 15.7 is reasonable to enable us to set up this fund at COP16. In this regard, we would like to express our appreciation of the elements expressed in Annex 3 on a possible dedicated global instrument for biodiversity finance, as these elements provide further rationale needed to guide the establishment and operationalization of the GBF. On the revised strategy for resource mobilization, the true test of its value is on answering the question as to what extent is the implementation of the strategy going to challenge the status quo and ensure the finance part of the means of implementation is effective to address the finance gap. We cannot afford to go on with the status quo lest we fail to effectively address the global crisis of biodiversity loss that has a catastrophic impact on humanity, especially in developing countries. The Executive Secretary earlier indicated that the GBF needs sufficient resources and that we need the same level of ambition as we saw in COP15, and further warned us that time is not on our side, as 2030 is just around the corner. We therefore dare not delay in ensuring that the implementation of the convention, its protocols, and the GBF are adequately resourced with a dedicated GBF. In conclusion, the achievement of the ambition as articulated in Target 90 with a minimum of $20 billion of ODA per year target requires bold decision and action in COP16. As South Africa, we remain available to provide further textual inputs and participation in the follow-up processes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, South Africa. The parties inliner, Nigeria, Kenya, Brazil. Nigeria, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the Secretariat for the gift of this staple pin. Happy International Biodiversity Day. Nigeria would like to align with the statement from Africa delivered by Zimbabwe and thanks the Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilization for the submission of the updated draft Resource Mobilization Strategy. Chair, Nigeria is concerned about the state of discussions on resource mobilization as we are closing in on 2 years post-adoption of KMGBF. We note with concern that discussions within the committee seem to reflect the entrenched positions already expressed during the Montreal negotiations. If we don't urgently change the state of play, we are clearly jeopardizing the likelihoods of success for the implementation of the KMGBF. The negotiations of Target 18 and 19 were arduous, and in the spirit of compromise, Nigeria agreed to make deeply felt concessions on the level of support to be provided by developed country parties and on the mechanisms set to procure this support. And despite these concessions, we see through the discussions on resource mobilization that there is a strong reluctance from developed countries to set a clear path towards ensuring that the commitment in Target 19A to developed countries is met. Why aren't the discussions of the advisory committee focused on setting up a clear path towards meeting this commitment? 2025 is around the corner, and we still don't know how and whether the commitment to increase international biodiversity finance to developing countries in 19A will be met. This is clearly alarming, and a lot more work needs to be done to ensure we can transparently track progress made towards meeting this biodiversity finance pledge made to the developing world. Discussions of the committee should focus on that, given the crucial role international biodiversity finance plays in unlocking resources domestically. We are concerned to see that the issues we raised about relying on the GEF instead of creating a more responsive global biodiversity fund continue to be put aside, just like they were during the Montreal negotiations. Our experience of the GEF clearly points to the significant delays in funding allocations concerns, with governance paralyzing decision-making and discrepancies between funding allocations and biodiversity priorities. We cannot ignore these concerns, and the advisory committee should at least launch a targeted needs assessment, focusing on identifying the problem paralyzing the GEF and setting up immediate funding mechanisms. More work needs to be done on resource mobilization, and the advisory committee should definitely continue its discussion, but this should ensure the commitment to increase international biodiversity finance to developing countries to at least $20 billion annually by 2025 is met. For every dollar provided by developed countries, far more dollars are mobilized by developing countries through domestic resource mobilization. We must ensure that a clear path is set to map out and track progress made in Target 19A. We urge everyone in this room to follow us in ensuring that we secure a commitment by developed countries to agree to provide necessary plan and timeline to release such funds. Explain the mechanism and processes through which this US $20 billion by 2025 will be made available, and keep the financial mechanisms related to DSI separate from these options. I thank you.
Thank you, Nigeria. The parties in queue are Kenya, Brazil, Uganda, Norway. Kenya, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Chair. Kenya supports the Africa statement made by Zimbabwe. Kenya's statement is on the recommendations for draft decisions on 1, the strategy for resource mobilization, and 2, the global instrument for biodiversity finance. Chair, Kenya welcomes the work of the Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilization. 2 key tasks of this committee included: 1, guidance to subsidiary body on implementation on whether to create a dedicated financing mechanism which could be designated Global Biodiversity Fund, and what the options are to operationalize it. 2, whether the trust fund and the Global Environment Facility established by Decision 15.7 should be designated Global Biodiversity Fund. These items do seem to be still work in progress. Kenya notes a lack of clarity on the achievement of the obligations under Target 19 of the Global Biodiversity Framework. It is particularly unclear to what extent the target of international flows has increased towards United States dollars 20 billion by 2025, which is only 7 months away. The risk for yet again missing the 2030 target seems imminent. We miss a 2010, 2020, 2030, nearly 5 years away. Kenya recommends amendments to the draft recommendations to the Conference of Parties as follows. For strategy for resource mobilization, Kenya proposes addition of a new paragraph 7 to read, decides to appoint a panel of experts to carry out analysis on all financial flows for the period of the Global Biodiversity Framework to determine the extent to which parties have met their obligations under Target 19 of the Global Biodiversity Framework and report to the 17th Conference of Parties. Under the Global Instrument for Biodiversity Finance, Kenya proposes amendment of paragraph 12 to read, decides to establish a dedicated global instrument for biodiversity finance to mobilize resources from all sources commensurate to the ambition of the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Further, Chair, Kenya proposes an amendment of paragraph 13 to read, also decides to establish expert and advisory committee to develop the modalities for the operationalization of the dedicated global instrument for biodiversity finance, and also to consider the future of the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund and a report to the 17th Conference of Parties. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Kenya. Brazil, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Brazil aligns itself with the statement by Jamaica on behalf of GRULIC. We would like to thank the co-chairs and all participants of the Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilization for the excellent work done, which provides us with a solid basis for our discussions. Mr. Chair, if we are serious about implementing the Convention and the Global Biodiversity Framework, then we need to be equally serious about resource mobilization. Since COP15, Brazil has significantly increased public spending for actions aimed at protecting biodiversity, including through the protection of indigenous territories, as the reduction of the Amazon rainforest deforestation by more than 60% demonstrates. We count on the support of partners, both through bilateral and multilateral channels, but we inevitably come to the same conclusion that every developing country speaking before us. The scale is just not enough. A fact that should not be overlooked is that developing countries in general, and megadiverse countries in particular, bear a higher burden than others. This is why we also cannot overlook the differentiated responsibilities of developed countries and the principle of equity. Our needs are in the scale of billions, but cooperation comes in the scale of millions. Our call for developed countries to meet these obligations is obviously without prejudice to the understanding that we need to tap at every source. This is the spirit that inspired Brazil to launch the Tropical Forest Forever facility, a collective initiative to finance the conservation and sustainable use of tropical forests all over the world. We are also open to reflecting on how to better engage the private sector, the financial sector, and philanthropy. But such an exercise needs to be sober, given a frequent tendency to overestimate their current and potential contributions. It would also need to be well-meaning so that it genuinely aims at increasing the mobilization of new and additional resources from these sources, not indirectly aiming to reduce, preclude, or dilute those that also need to be mobilized through official development assistance. We appreciate ongoing efforts to enhance awareness of the role of central banks and measures to address risks, dependencies, and impacts across the financial sector, as proposed by the draft strategy on resource mobilization. At the same time, we would recommend a more flexible approach consistent with relevant SDGs. We further believe that some elements of paragraph 5A of the draft strategy should be reviewed to maintain coherence with target 19A of the GBF. Regarding Annex 2, we would recommend caution on actions that may fall beyond the scope of the Convention. Mr. Chair, Brazil supports the recommendation for the work on resource mobilization to continue in an open-ended working group, ensuring an inclusive intergovernmental process. In this regard, we welcome Annex 3 of the recommendations submitted by the Advisory Committee, which contains a list of qualities that, along with the criteria contained in Articles 20 and 21, we would like to see in an ideal financial mechanism of the Convention. Discussing them in depth with objectivity and legal clarity is the path to address resource mobilization with the seriousness it deserves. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Brazil. The parties in the queue are Uganda, Norway, India, Guatemala, Tonga, Russian Federation, United Kingdom. Uganda, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Uganda aligns with the position of Africa region presented by Zimbabwe in respect to resource mobilization. We acknowledge the note prepared by Secretariat pursuant to resource mobilization and attendant reports, especially on the work of Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilization and Technical Expert Group on Financial Reporting. We note that the Advisory Committee was not in position to finalize its work without taking into account the work of the ad hoc open-ended working group on benefit sharing from the use of digital sequence information on genetic resources. This work is very important, and we urge for a clear strategy for the committee to complete the work. Uganda takes note of the draft revised strategy for resource mobilization for the period from 2025 to 2030 in light of the visible financing gaps affecting developing economies. Uganda supports the urgent need for the establishment of a dedicated and accessible fund without postponing COP17, with a clear mechanism of administration and operationalization to the effect of implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. We shall engage and further submit textual amendments with the text. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Uganda. Norway, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The implementation of the Common Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, in line with Target 19 of the framework, requires sufficient means of implementation. To achieve this, there is a need for support from all sources and a whole of government and whole of society approach to implementation. We hope that the multilateral mechanism on digital sequence information can contribute substantially to benefit sharing and towards the 2030 targets. Norway refers to the 20 by 25 milestone in Target 19. As mentioned by other parties, this is a very ambitious milestone towards the 2030 target. To fulfill this milestone and target, more countries need to take on responsibilities as developed countries to expand the donor base. This will be very beneficial for the remaining developing countries, in particular, least developed countries who will receive substantially more funding. We welcome Grenada as developed country and encourage developing countries in a position to do so to take on responsibilities as developed countries, so we can move towards the 20 by 25 milestone. The deadline for this is June 1st. We note and take part in the reforms and modernization efforts of the GEF in collaboration with all its partners. We use our experience from supporting environmental projects for more than 30 years and collectively strive for the most efficient possible delivery of support to the implementation of the KM-GBF. Norway also supports the recommendation to postpone to COP17 the consideration of whether the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund, the GBFF, should be designated the Global Biodiversity Fund. Finally, regarding Annex 3 in the document, with elements for discussion on a possible dedicated global instrument for biodiversity finance, we do not see the value of such a list of elements and would suggest its deletion. Norway will send in a written submission with textual changes. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Norway. India, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Chair. India acknowledges the work undertaken by the Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilization and the Technical Expert Group on Finance Reporting in bringing out the draft revised strategy for resource mobilization, a non-exhaustive list of voluntary actions, and the elements for discussion on a possible dedicated global instrument for biodiversity finance. We also welcome the adoption of revised strategy for resource mobilization. It is noted that the aligning fiscal and financial flows with goals and targets of KMGBF, encouraging the private sector to reduce negative impacts and to increase the positive impacts on biodiversity progressively. We also welcome the adoption of non-exhaustive list of voluntary actions to strengthen, simplify, and reform existing instruments for biodiversity finance, and adoption of elements for discussion on a possible dedicated global instrument for biodiversity finance. We wish to state that the decision 15/5 on the monitoring framework, the headline indicator D.3 on private funding had been identified, for which an agreed up-to-date methodology doesn't exist. We would like to mention that the resource mobilization is key to implement the KMGBF. Various ways and means for identifying new areas towards mobilizing financial resources for implementing KMGBF needs to be explored. India, through Biofin project, had adopted a biodiversity finance plan to implement the NBSAP in convergence with relevant national policies and missions. We identified some possible solutions like mainstreaming biodiversity in relevant sectors, enhanced corporate social responsibility funds, enhancing resources for benefit sharing from access of the bioresources, fintech for biotech conservation, task force for national nature-related risk assessment and financial resources. Even though the gap is huge, it is essential to increase the financial resources substantially from all resources in an effective and timely manner to achieve the ambitious targets. We urge the developed parties, country parties, that voluntarily take the strategy for mobilizing resources in their efforts to provide new, additional, adequate, predictable, and timely for financial resources for developing countries. Further, for the developing countries, there is a need for capacity building and development, technical assistance, and technological cooperation for financial planning and effective resource use management. Further, while appreciating the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund by GEF, India would like to mention that GEF should establish appropriate institutional mechanism keeping in view fairness, transparency, inclusiveness, and participation, equitable and representative governance structure for ensuring an efficient, transparent, and consultative mechanism for sanctioning of funds as per national priorities. There is a need to ensure continuous, speedy, and robust capitalization of GBFF in accordance with 15/7. Additional funds for augmenting the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund may be explored from other Rio conventions and other biodiversity-related conventions, civil society organizations. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, India. The parties in the queue are Guatemala, Tonga, Russian Federation, United Kingdom, Bangladesh, Malawi. Guatemala, you have the floor, please.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for giving me the floor. We support the declaration made by GRULAC, presented by Jamaica. The mobilization of financial resources that are additional, as well as the diversity of the instruments and mechanisms for these finances, is a cornerstone for the advance in the implementation of our global biodiversity framework. Guatemala is carrying out progress in this matter, increasing national investment and widening new incentives for conservation and the sustainable use of biodiversity, promoting private-public alliances, amongst other things. We observe with concern the low level of undertakings for international cooperation reflected in the low recollection of financial resources destined to the Global Biodiversity Fund, which does not reflect the ambition that we have in Target 19 of the global framework. And therefore, we call upon those who have made commitments urgently to significantly increase in an efficient, opportune, and easy manner for financial resources at international level in conformity with Article 20 and 21 of the Convention and Target 19 of the Global Framework in order to be able to implement efficiently the strategies and national plans of action in terms of biodiversity. Mr. Chairman, Guatemala supports the establishment of a fund and an instrument that is specifically related to biodiversity under the authority of the COP of our convention, and this will increase the level of importance and relevancy of biodiversity in order to be able to face the triple challenge that we're facing in terms of the environment. And additionally, we consider it to be important that Annex 1 of the draft recommendation, paragraph 5, on new additional resources, and paragraph 2 in Annex 2 for international financing include a reference to financial mechanisms from transactions of credits for biodiversity as a potential mechanism to increase international financing for biodiversity, coming mostly from the private sector. And we will be sending you our suggestions in writing and participating in the group that will be set up under your leadership. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Gautamela. Tonga, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Chair, and happy Biodiversity Day to you all. Tonga is speaking on behalf of the Pacific Island countries who are present here at this meeting, namely the Cook Islands, Fiji, Tonga, and Vanuatu. Chair, the Pacific Island countries collectively welcomes the revised strategy for resource mobilization, covering targets 14, 15, 18, and 18 in Annex 1 of document CBD/SBI/4/5, an ambitious and action-oriented resource mobilization strategy covering the period from 2025 to 2030. The final decision on this item must ensure that the long-term resource mobilization strategy is on track for operationalization of the implementation of the KMGBF, so that adequate resources corresponding with ambition of the GBF are available to developing countries, including SIDS and LDCs throughout the implementation period. In particular, the resource mobilization strategy should include clear guidance for the timely delivery of, as supported by other parties, financial commitments made in Target 19, especially the commitment to increase international financing from developed countries to $20 billion USD annually by 2025, which is just next year, is critical for the successful implementation of the strategy. Therefore, Pacific Island countries calls on developed countries and other countries that are in the position to do so to prioritize the timely delivery and rapid mobilization of the commitment in Target 19A by next year. Secondly, the identification by 2025 and reformation elimination by 2030 of $500 billion USD per year of subsidies harmful for biodiversity in line with the goals and objectives of the Convention. If we do not address harmful subsidies, we will not be able to achieve the KM-GBF. I thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Tonga. The parties in the queue are Russian Federation, UK, Bangladesh, Malawi, Syrian Arab Republic, Cuba. Russian Federation, you have the floor, please.
Спасибо. Thank you so much, Chairman. Well, firstly, regarding the updated fund mobilization strategy, we agree to support it. We also share concerns regarding the countries who have spoken earlier regarding the situation with ensuring appropriate and timely financial resources. Consideration of financial resources and the mechanism, as a lot of other countries have already indicated, should be based exclusively on the primacy of Articles 20 and 21 of the CBD and full compliance of any COP decisions with these articles. We should also prepare a list of criteria for an optimal financial mechanism, one that meets the needs of all parties to the CBD, based on the recommendations of the Financial Resource Mobilization Group, Annex 3 of the document. We are confident that the GEF, currently temporarily serving as a financial instrument, can be a full-fledged mechanism. However, only if such criteria are fully met and appropriate governance and decision-making reforms undertaken to bring them fully in line with the CBD system, something which has been referred to by a great many here, including the obligation to provide resources to all CBD parties identified as recipient countries without any politically motivated restrictions. Were it to be otherwise, we do not believe it will be possible for the GEF to fulfill the functions of the Global Biodiversity Facility and the Global Framework Fund established in 2023, and we back the creation of both funds. The GEF continues to adopt a politically driven approach to securing country support. In this respect, the following statement should be provided in the final report of the meeting, of the SBI4 meeting, as revised and submitted in writing to the Secretariat. We back the statement made by GRULAC, Brazil, Egypt, and a number of other states to continue the process of work on resource mobilization and the financial mechanism through the establishment of an open-ended working group. This issue has been discussed within the BRICS group of countries, and the BRICS countries will in turn take an active part in these discussions. For our part, we fully support the proposal to establish just such a working group. Now, we stand ready to use the draft recommendations prepared by the Resource Mobilization Advisory Committee, and comments on the text in writing will be provided to the Secretariat. I thank you, sir.
Thank you, Russian Federation. United Kingdom, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Chair. The United Kingdom welcomes the important work undertaken by the Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilisation, and we would like to thank all the members of the committee for their contributions. We think that the exploration of the biodiversity finance landscape provided to us in INF 10 provides a solid basis for a common understanding of different sources of biodiversity finance in light of the ambitious outcomes at COP15. Of course, the UK was delighted to see the global community come together at that COP to agree every goal and target of the KM-GBF, including the commitment to raising $30 billion of international finance by 2030 and $20 billion by 2025, both of which remain within reach. And you can count on the UK to continue to work hard to help meet those targets. We have committed, for instance, to spend $3.8 billion on nature by 2026, and we announced an initial contribution of $12.5 million to the GBF fund in August last year. But the UK's position has long been that we need to ensure that our discussions on resource mobilisation consider and cover the entire and complex breadth of the nature finance landscape. Quite simply, there needs to be more money from every source, as described in Targets 18 and 19, if we are together to close the nature finance gap. That is why, for example, the UK is taking steps to work with partners around the world to identify and reform environmentally harmful subsidies and supporting others to do the same through UNDP's BioFin program. And we're supporting the work of an independent international panel of experts to develop modalities for high-integrity biodiversity credit markets. So we welcome the fact that the updated strategy for resource mobilization takes a holistic view, reflecting the language and approach agreed in the KMGBF. We will continue to support forward progress and ambitious momentum on all aspects of the strategy and expect that any ongoing work on nature finance in future will reflect the wide range of potential funding sources before us. Finally, we would like to continue to draw attention to the invitation in Target 19, reiterated by the Executive Secretary, for parties to voluntarily assume the obligations of developed country parties. We urge those who are in a position to do so to take up that invitation. We will submit our comments on the papers in writing. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, United Kingdom. Parties in the queue are Bangladesh, Malawi, Syrian Arab Republic, Cuba. Bangladesh, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and happy Biodiversity Day to every party. Bangladesh appreciates all the efforts taken by the CBD Secretariat and expresses her immense gratitude. As a committed party of UNCBD, Bangladesh incorporated conservation of biodiversity in the Constitution duly. In Article 18A, we have incorporated the conservation of biodiversity as one of the significant duty of the government. It formulated Biodiversity Act 2017 that promotes research on biodiversity and biological resources, leading towards biotechnological inventions and their commercial utilization through preparing a nationwide biodiversity register and documentation of traditional knowledge. Bangladesh formulated Biosafety Rules 2018, the Ecologically Critical Area ECA Management Rules 2016, Protected Area PA Regulations 2017, declared 3 marine protected areas. And our government is trying to secure funds for formulating biodiversity rules. The mentioned Act, rules, and regulations have several governance structures, and Bangladesh already ensured the participation of local communities there. In the Ecologically Critical Area Management Rules, the village conservation group must be formed with the members of local communities. Once registered, the village community groups become legally eligible to protect the ECS, avail financial and technical resources. In one ECA wetlands in Bangladesh, 28 village conservation groups have been registered under a project funded by the USAID, and they have become the legal custodian of the wetland there. By expressing solidarity with other developing countries on mobilizing adequate resources, Bangladesh seeks cooperation and assistance from the Secretariat and Advisory Committee for forming an intergovernmental committee in the South Asia region to work more effectively, especially on ABS and DSI. Bangladesh places submissions for sufficient resources in the form of grants from alongside GEF, International Development Partners, OECD countries, to conduct programs or projects for the following activities. These are research and consultation on the gap analysis for revising and implementation of NBSAP, activation of the governance structure in the Act, rules, and regulations for sustainable management of biodiversity, prioritizing the village conservation group for strong monitoring and supervision of biodiversity conservation, ensuring the active participation of women in every governance structure, especially in the VCGs as negotiator and decision maker instead of remaining as the beneficiaries. Identification of more areas to declare as ecologically critical area, protected area, marine protected area, and OECM. Enhance coordinated mechanism to minimize the gap between bureaucrats, regulators, and other stakeholders for achieving the targets of NBSAP. capacity building and skill development training activities on natural resources, accounting service, ecosystem valuation to ensure sustainable implementation of ABS as well as DSI for local communities, small ethnic groups, incorporating their traditional knowledge with a gender-responsive approach. I thank you, respected Chair.
Thank you, Bangladesh. The parties in the queue are Malawi, Syrian Arab Republic, Cuba, Togo, China, Canada, Mexico. Malawi, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Malawi supports the statement made by Zimbabwe on behalf of Africa and appreciates the progress made on the implementation of Decision 15/7 on resource mobilization and work of the Advisory Committee of Resource Mobilization. Chair, as part of its implementation of Target 19, Malawi has, through the biofin process, identified a number of financial solutions which it is implementing to increase its domestic funding. We, however, realize that the ambitious agenda set by the goals of the KMGBF requires substantial funding from all sources. That is why Target 19 on resource mobilization encourages the increase in financial flows from developed countries to developing countries, among others, to attain our goals of $200 billion annually by 2025. Not attaining this target for us simply means not attaining the goals and targets on the KMGBF, and it is our hope that we will advance on our efforts to attain the target. Chair, as we are grappling with where to find resources for conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, Malawi recognizes the opportunity that the establishment of multilateral mechanism for benefit sharing from the use of digital sequence information on genetic resources, including a global fund, provides for resource mobilization. We therefore look forward to ensuring that outcomes of the ongoing discussions on DSI contribute as one of the innovative solutions for resource mobilization. Malawi appreciates results from the landscape study on resource mobilization, and it is our hope that the gaps identified in the study will be turned into actions. Specifically, Malawi recognizes the importance of strengthening and simplifying the existing financing instruments. The increased access to global environmental facilities funds and its disbursement is an area which Malawi would like to see improved. Much as we note that the GBFF was established to fast-track the implementation of KMGBF, we still agree with other African countries who have spoken before us that there is still a need for a dedicated fund that will consider elements that are being proposed for improved biodiversity funding. Having a special dedicated fund for biodiversity under the COP is ideal. The governance regime is an enabler on how effective any funding mechanism can be. The extrapolatory study has provided us with lessons on how other agreements under guidance of their respective COPs are operating, how UNFCCC is operating with the GCF, how the Montreal Protocol has multilateral funding for implementation, and Minamata has a dedicated specific international program. It is our ambition that soon CBD should have such a mechanism where governance is under the authority of the COP. We will submit our textual amendments in writing. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Malawi. Syrian Arab Republic, you have the floor, please.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. كل الشكر للسكرتاري.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the Secretariat for these documents. Mr. Chairman. We are entirely in agreement with the document and its annexes as a basis for our discussion. We must highlight the importance of financial resource mobilization for the convention and its protocols. We thank the co-chairs and the advisory committee for the work that they have carried out. We support the strategy, which would take into consideration the continuity of national strategies, as well as an international convention, and a mechanism for financing under the authority of COP, so that finances go to where the greatest need lies. There should be such a mechanism with ways to have resources to it so that it's possible to appeal any decisions, a right of recourse. We need to have financial mobilization of resources, but the mobilization of such resources cannot be done unless it's transparent, and this is why we call upon all funds, the GEV, to begin to show more transparency so that we can conserve biodiversity throughout the world, particularly in Syria, where we have known war for the last 10 years. We have not received any financial aid since 2012, and over 12 years, and this continues. Although we've had some requests for projects that we have submitted, we still have not received funds. The Syrian Arab Republic has been excluded from the list of countries that could benefit from the Kunming-Montreal finances, and therefore Syria supports the Russian Federation when it speaks about political impartiality for the way in which parties should be treated. Mr. Chairman, those countries that have received financing because they don't have enough funds, how can the Syrian Arab Republic continue its work? When we've received no financing since 2012, how can we implement our national strategy in that case? Thank you.
Thank you, Syrian Arab Republic. Cuba, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. First of all, Cuba would like to associate itself with Jamaica's intervention on behalf of GRULAC and wishes to express, on behalf of our government, its satisfaction with the work carried out by the Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilization, and particularly the co-chairs, in preparing the documents that began their discussion today during SBI. We believe that the text provides a solid basis for our discussions on the subject up to COP16 and has great expectations regarding the contributions, for example, of developing countries to these texts in this discussion process that will end in Cali. We also support the continuation of the deliberations of this committee or another mechanism to continue to refine the basis of the international financial architecture available to the global framework. As GRULAC said, it is not the ambition that we want, but the ambition that we need. Some reflections on the subject. The discussion process we're initiating today should in no way lead us to modify, rewrite, or establish an interpretation that is alien to the basic concepts of the well-known articles of the Convention that relate to the subject, such as Goal 19 in its entirety, which quantifies them. As a developing country, Cuba is extremely concerned about the lack of clarity in the roles, mandates, and scope of the components of the resource provider regime called all sources. On the one hand, every meeting, every report confirms the gradual reduction of public funding from governments of developed countries, which not only contradicts the provisions of Article 20, but also aggravates the international financial context for the implementation of the global framework by failing to comply with several of its provisions, not to mention the issue of environmental justice, which we have chosen to forget in order to accommodate the policies of some. Look at the figures. The Global Framework Fund, which we place in the GEF, has received since announcement in 2023 pledges amounting to approximately 200 million and has only received just under 100 million, with only 6 months to go before day zero of the start of Goal 19A, which sets a commitment of 20 billion for the year 2025. Could this be the reason for the low approval of the number of projects? Despite the good work done, we still have time to work to achieve this important benefit for humanity. On the other hand, we pay special attention to the growing responsibility given to the international private sector and to the financial options for mobilizing domestic resources in the financial architecture of the countries through mechanisms that are not entirely in the domain of the implementing entities in our countries, despite the very positive work of initiatives such as BioFin. Cuba is not close to working in that direction on the basis of our national circumstances, capabilities, and legislation, expresses its willingness to continue deliberating on the subject with a constructive approach and proactive attitude, but will refuse to allow its role to exceed in amount and impact the unavoidable international public financing. Thank you very much. The speaker was speaking too fast.
Thank you. Thank you, Cuba. My request to parties, please speak, reduce your speed, and so that translators get, hold on what you are speaking. So please bear that in mind. Thank you. Togo, you have the floor, please.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you so much, sir. Togo welcomes the progress made in implementing Decision 15/7 on resource mobilization, and indeed commends the work of the Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilization during the intersessional period. Chair, we all appreciate the strong commitment expressed by states during the adoption of the new global framework back in December 2022 in Montreal, to work towards reversing the loss of biodiversity globally. However, Togo remains deeply concerned by the slow progress being made towards achieving Goal 19. Goal 19, a key pillar of the framework's success. This is why Togo strongly supports Africa's statement made by Zimbabwe. Indeed, sir, if we don't want the global framework, and indeed other international planning tools, to become nothing more than pipe dreams and chimeras, the time more than ever before is to opt for the creation of the Global Biodiversity Fund, and to do this at the next Conference of the Parties in October. With this in mind, Togo supports the proposal to extend the mandate of the Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilization beyond the fourth intersessional meeting. This in order to engage in exercises in reflection within the open-ended working group on indicators for monitoring financial resources, especially digital sequencing information, DSI, and to formulate concrete proposals for submission to the next conference. I thank you, sir.
Thank you, Togo. China, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Chair. The Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilization and the Technical Expert Group on Financial Reporting have carried out fruitful work, which has provided a good foundation for our deliberations. We thank them for their hard work. China welcomes the revised strategy for resource mobilization as contained in document CBD-SBI/545. We believe it provides a clear pathway for achieving the fund-related targets of the KMGBF and provides all parties to have good basis for resource mobilization. China also welcomes the proposal to develop, update, and implement national biodiversity financing plans or similar instruments in accordance with the national needs, priorities, and circumstances. We have the following suggestions. First, in the resource mobilization strategy, it should be further emphasized that developed countries make better contributions on time. According to Target 19, by 2025, biodiversity-related international funding should reach at least $20 billion per year. Now the deadline is approaching. We call on developed countries to fulfill their funding commitments as soon as possible. We know that while the private sector plays an important role in meeting global resource mobilization targets, funding from the private sector is unlikely to grow significantly in the short term, and public funding from developed countries must be leveraged. Second, based on the exploration of the biodiversity finance landscape prepared by the Secretariat, we propose to request the Secretariat to authorize further studies on topics such as the implementation of safeguards for biodiversity financing mechanisms and lessons learned from managing different financing mechanisms. Third, concerning a global instrument for biodiversity finance, we propose to, based on the effectiveness of GBFF, consider whether or not to designate it as the Global Biodiversity Fund. As requested by parties, we suggest that specific criteria be developed for this global instrument to assess whether a new financial mechanism beyond the GBFF
资源调动问题不限名额工作组以此形式继续相关问题的讨论。再次感谢主席。
The speaker was again speaking too fast for us to be able to interpret.
Thank you, China. I again make a request. Please speak at a slower pace, and so that translators find it convenient to translate into other languages. Kindly keep this in mind. Translators are repeatedly informing me that the speakers are going at a very high speed. So kindly bear it in mind. Thank you. Canada, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Chair, and I'll do my best to speak at a slower pace. Distinguished colleagues, regarding SBI Agenda Item 4, Canada has 3 key points to raise in today's plenary, and we will submit corresponding text recommendations to the Secretariat. First, Canada would like to advocate for continued ambitious domestic and international actions to achieve KMGBF resource mobilization targets, with a focus on mobilizing resources from all sources and at all levels through both public and private resources and financial flows and innovative financing mechanisms and partnerships. In this way, we look forward to working with other parties this week to shape a recommendation under Agenda Item 4 that reflects this important collective action by all parties and stakeholders at all levels to close the $700 billion biodiversity financing gap. Given this, we would also like to emphasize the importance of all parties developing national biodiversity finance plans, which we recommend be inserted into the recommendation for Item 4A. Second, Canada would like to take an evidence-based approach to developing recommendations on resource mobilization, especially related to the review of the strategy for resource mobilization, assessing gaps and overlaps in the biodiversity finance landscape, and exploration of proposals for a global instrument on biodiversity finance to mobilize resources from all sources. In this way, Canada is generally supportive of the updated resource mobilization strategy in Annex 1, with some minor text modifications that we will submit, and find it to be a very useful guide for all parties
actors and stakeholders when considering resource mobilization. However, Canada would recommend the alignment of strategy recommendations with relevant COP15 decisions. For example, the review of the strategy for resource mobilization should occur at the 18th meeting of the COP, which was agreed at COP15 rather than the 17th meeting. Canada is also supportive of the finalized biodiversity finance landscape, which we find to be a very useful document, especially the breadth of analysis of gaps and opportunities to mobilize finance at the domestic level, international level, within the private finance sphere, and via important actions by Indigenous peoples, local communities, women, and youth. From our perspective, the inclusion of a list of non-exhaustive voluntary actions in Annex 2 of the recommendation can be supported, again with some minor text modifications. Third, on the exploration of proposals for a global instrument on biodiversity finance to mobilize resources from all sources, we appreciate the work of the Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilization in supporting fruitful discussions, especially the co-chairs and generous meeting hosts, the Democratic Republic of Congo and Colombia, in addition to all of the committee members. From Canada's perspective, the establishment and capitalization of the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund under the Global Environment Facility, or the GEF, which serves as the financial mechanism for the CBD, is an important step forward in mobilizing resources from all sources to support the implementation of the KMGBF. In this way, the GBF Fund and the GEF are existing, successful global instruments supporting the mobilization of biodiversity finance, and a new fund or financial mechanism is not required, which is also supported by evidence in the landscape study. We understand that the stocktake review of the GBF Fund will take place at COP18, as per the COP15 decision, and we look forward to participating in this review process. As such, we do not support the recommended establishment of an open-ended intergovernmental process and do not support the inclusion of Annex 3 in the decision under item 4A. Finally, we would like to reiterate a key conclusion of the biodiversity finance landscape study, which is that we need all parties and stakeholders to actively mobilize resources in order to achieve the goals of Target 19. We would like to thank Grenada for indicating its willingness to voluntarily assume the obligations of developed country parties in accordance with Article 20 of the Convention, and we would support the inclusion of a recommendation in the text that requests the Secretariat in making a subsequent notification inviting developing country parties and parties with economies in transition to consider following Grenada's lead in voluntarily assuming these obligations. As noted, Canada will provide the Secretariat with text amendments in writing which reflect the points I have raised today, and we look forward to continued discussions here in Nairobi. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Canada. The parties in queue are Mexico, Australia, Switzerland, Fiji, New Zealand, Japan. Mexico, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mexico recognizes the importance of finding resource mobilization strategies from all sources in order to make more agile the implementation around the 23 targets of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. We reiterate our position regarding the mobilization of resources to guarantee that Indigenous peoples, as well as other key stakeholders in conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, such as women and youth, are able to have access to agile, adequate, direct, and appropriate financing, considering what's been established in international conventions regarding their rights on the management of their territory, of natural resources, and the development aspects. And we encourage the fund, the Global Environment Facility, to explore ways to improve and increase and facilitate direct access to financing. Furthermore, we recognize the fact that it's not only important to guarantee the provision of financial resources, we also believe that it's important and fundamental to have the necessary conditions and welcome the improvement of capacity building so that governments are able to establish an institutional architecture as well as mechanisms for guaranteeing the access to such resources, including the implementation of safeguards, both environmental as well as social, for its effective implementation. We also would like to make an appeal to the various stakeholders to support the strategy for resource mobilization for conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, as well as to collaborate in improving the progress reports in this matter. Furthermore, we believe it's fundamental to continue with the dialogue on whether the Global Framework Fund should be designated the Global Biodiversity Fund while we evaluate its operation under the provisions of the member states. We would require that should be adopted for its establishment, and we would therefore agree with the postponement of such a decision. The increase of the mobilization of domestic resources is important, but taking into account national conditions to implement relevant activities in accordance with various contexts, we will make specific recommendations, and we have already sent those to the Secretariat for its approval. Thank you.
Thank you, Mexico. Australia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Australia thanks the Secretariat and the Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilisation for all their work in bringing these issues here today for parties' consideration and discussion. So we acknowledge that increased resources from all sources, public and private, international and domestic, will be required to support the effective GBF implementation. And we also recognise the challenges faced by many developing countries in implementing the GBF, particularly small island developing states. As raised by Norway, the UK and Canada, we agree that there is the need to look beyond the traditional suite of donors to ensure that all countries that are in a position to do so contribute to bridging the biodiversity finance gap. And we welcome Grenada for coming forward in this regard. The resource mobilisation strategy is important to guide this work of all actors, and we'd like to see some stronger language to encourage those beyond the parties to the CBD, such as the private sector, to support the strategy's implementation. We appreciate the work of the Advisory Committee in updating the strategy in light of the GBF, and we have just a few suggested edits. Regarding the approach to monitoring and reviewing the strategy, we think some further clarity is needed regarding how this will intersect with the monitoring framework and the global review to allow assessment of progress whilst avoiding duplication of effort. Australia welcomes the study of the biodiversity finance landscape and its consideration of all the finance sources. We propose some adjustments to the decision text to note that work is needed to address the finance gap in all areas, not just international finance from developed countries. And we note that whilst the landscape study is a really useful analysis, it doesn't present a clear argument for a new dedicated global instrument. Regarding future discussions beyond COP16, Australia believes that focusing solely on a new instrument would be a misdirection of efforts when we should be discussing the broad suite of finance resources to mobilise the maximum resources possible. For this reason, like Canada and the EU, we don't support the proposed open-ended working group to discuss a dedicated global instrument for biodiversity finance, and Annex 3 is therefore not required. Discussion of the broad landscape of resources is something that the SBI can quite capably manage without placing additional burden on the Secretariat, which is already facing significant resourcing pressures. We will submit some specific text proposals in writing. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Australia. Switzerland, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Resource mobilization from all sources, public and private, international and domestic, and aligning financial flows are key for the implementation of the GBF. And Switzerland remains committed to contribute to achieving Target 19 and 18 and expects all parties and actors to do so and play their role in closing the finance gap in line with the interventions we've just heard and others, Canada, Norway, and UK. Switzerland welcomes the important advances over the past 18 months in implementing the decision COP15-7 on resource mobilization, both in terms of the work of the Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilization and the Technical Expert Group on Financial Reporting, as well as the achievement of the GEF of establishing and operationalizing the GBFF. We welcome the exploration of the biodiversity finance landscape prepared by the Secretariat with the inputs of the ACRM. It offers a comprehensive, maybe not exhaustive and entirely balanced overview of the current biodiversity finance landscape. Nevertheless, it serves as a useful basis for the discussion ahead of us. As others said, it does not provide any argument for the establishment of a new global biodiversity fund, for example. On the contrary, it encourages further coherence, coordination, and synergies among existing sources as a way of improving access to and flows of funding. We also welcome the revised resource mobilization strategy. While it's not perfect, we believe overall it provides reasonable guidance to parties on how to prepare national finance plans or similar planning instruments in the context of their NBSAPs. It reflects the key elements that are needed to mobilize resources for the implementation of the GBF. There are certain elements that could and should be strengthened in our view. However, we stand ready to work with parties to find balance and present a polished version to the COP. In Switzerland's view, the question of a global instrument for biodiversity finance cannot be separate from the question of the GBFF. These questions have to be considered together. Indeed, the GEF, including the newly established GBFF, are the mechanism for the provision of financial resources. As a consequence, a new dedicated global instrument for biodiversity finance is not warranted in our view. Accordingly, we do not think the Annex 3 should be included in the decision. Finally, Switzerland welcomes the engaged participation of parties here in Nairobi. It confirms the important role of the established body of the CBD, SBI and SABSTA as well. And they play an important role as fora for discussion of all issues related to resource mobilization. So we believe there is no need for establishing an intersessional process. Instead, the parties' discussion here and at future SBIs and SABSTA meetings should be complemented and informed by discussions in other relevant bodies and engagements with relevant stakeholders intersessionally. We will submit our proposed changes to the language in writing. Thank you.
Thank you, Switzerland. The parties in queue are Fiji, New Zealand, Japan, Republic of Moldova, Argentina, Ethiopia, Philippines. Fiji, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Fiji welcomes the revised strategy for resource mobilization in Annex 1 of document SBI 4/5 and aligns to the statement from Tonga on behalf of the Pacific. An ambitious and action-oriented resource mobilization strategy covering the period from 2025 to 2030 and providing a clear path to deliver the coming GBF, finance commitments including Target 14, 15, 18, and 19 will be one of the most important deliverables of COP16. Fiji recommends that the final decision on this item must ensure that the long-term resource mobilization strategy is on track for operationalization so that adequate resources corresponding with the ambition of the GBF are available to developing countries, including SEEDs and the least developed countries, throughout the implementation period. In particular, The resource mobilization strategy should include clear guidance for the timely delivery of 1, the identification by 2025 and elimination by 2030 of US $500 billion per year of subsidies harmful for biodiversity in line with the goals and objectives of the Convention. And secondly, the financial commitment made in Target 19, especially the commitment to increase international financing from developed countries annually by 2025, is critical for the successful implementation of the strategy. Therefore, Fiji calls on developed countries and other countries that are in the position to do so to prioritize the timely delivery and rapid mobilization of the commitment in Target 19A. Fiji recommends that the final decision on this item and any guidance to the GEF maintains the aspirational percentage of direct access funds dedicated to local communities, as well as the committed percentage allocation of funds to seeds and the least developed countries. In addition to rapid mobilization of funds, rapid deployment to developing countries, local communities, IPLCs, and other rights holders like women and girls are equally key to a successful GBF implementation. We will submit a specific text proposal for the draft recommendation on the procedures for the global review to the Secretariat in writing. We thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Fiji. New Zealand, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Chair. New Zealand would like to thank the Secretariat for their efforts to compile the Biodiversity Finance Landscape paper. We agree with the UK, Canada and others that the paper includes some good points for us to take forward in our discussions on biodiversity finance. New Zealand is pleased to see a positive trend in finance for biodiversity, but we note that a significant gap remains. To address this, New Zealand supports encouraging the use of all sources of funding, including actions to support private sector engagement. We'll propose a text edit to paragraph 4 of the preamble to reflect this, consistent with agreed language in Target 19 of the KM-GBF. We will also propose an addition in paragraph 5 under the section Strategy for Resource Mobilisation to acknowledge that global biodiversity-related conventions should not only increase cooperation, but also seek to avoid duplication in their implementation. We acknowledge and thank the ACRM for their work to revise the resource mobilisation strategy, which injects urgency into mobilising the biodiversity resources to 2030. New Zealand's strong preference is that the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund be given time to embed and deliver biodiversity outcomes before reopening any discussions on a financial instrument. In that regard, we question whether it is a good use of our time and resources to have intersessional work on a new fund at this time, as proposed in paragraph 12. Like the EU, Norway, Canada and Australia, we would also support deleting Annex 3. Thank you.
Thank you, New Zealand. Japan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Japan would like to take this opportunity to thank the CBD Secretariat, the Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilization, and the Technical Expert Group on Financial Reporting for their hard work and dedication. Japan believes that the strategy for resource mobilization, as well as national biodiversity plans, should be flexible enough to reflect different national circumstances on biodiversity finance. We also believe it is crucial to mobilize resources from all sources across sectors, domestic, international, public, and private, seeking synergies with climate-related finance. We believe that we should focus on the operation of GBF Fund, which is up and running. In this respect, we also suggest Annex 3 on global instrument to be deleted from the strategy. Creating such a fund does not accelerate the achievement of Target 19. Our specific suggestions to CBD/SBI/4/5 will be submitted in writing. We look forward to effective and constructive discussions at this SBI. Thank you.
Thank you, Japan. Republic of Moldova, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Moldova supports the revised strategy for resource mobilization for the period of 2025-2030 for the ambitious Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework as contained in the Annex 1, as a flexible framework to guide the implementation of the goals and targets of the framework related to resource mobilization, taking national priorities and circumstances into account. We support increasing, enhancing, and broadening total biodiversity-related international financial resources provided to developing countries as well as countries with economies in transition. Moldova supports the reports of the Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilization and the Technical Expert Group on Financial Reporting. We would like also to highlight that the GEF strategies should be guided by the COP guidance and decisions. However, there is a practice of today that biodiversity focal area resources from the country's star allocations are going to the integrated environmental programs, which are not always follow the guidance of the CBD COPs. We urge that GEF and the GBF fund has dedicated financial mechanism to priority to providing resources to support the implementation of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework and the COP-MOP decisions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Moldova. Argentina, you have the floor, please.
Gracias. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Argentina supports the intervention made by Jamaica on behalf of the GRULAC. Article 20 of the Convention on Biological Diversity identifies very clearly the strategies for mobilization of resources under the Convention. All parties need to mobilize domestic resources in accordance with their capacities, and in addition, the parties which are developing must find new and additional financial resources so that developing parties are able to deal with the incremental costs of implementation. The mobilization of resources is an integral part of the decisions adopted in COP15. And only with proper commitment to adequate and sufficient implementation for developing countries will we be able to achieve the ambitious targets of the global framework. Argentina thanks the Democratic Republic of Congo and Colombia for having been hosts of the two meetings which took place for the advisory group on mobilization of financial resources and for the hospitality that was provided to the member states there present. Argentina agrees with the importance of inviting the advisory group on financial mobilization to meet for a third time in person in order to be able to finalize the work that was carried out under the terms of reference, including, but not limited to, the question regarding to the identification of the income received in accordance with Resolution 15.9. The subsidiary body for implementation could consider this result in its fifth meeting. Argentina supports the work carried out to update the mobilization of financial resources from all sources, recalling the responsibility of countries which are developed in this regard. With regard to the strategy, we would like to make the following points. In terms of financing for biodiversity, we cannot have any approximation of a unique source. It is necessary to have approaches which are able to confront the environmental issues and with the necessities for conservation for the receiving countries, the beneficiary countries. The strategy should take into account the specific circumstances of developing countries themselves. The disparity, the lack of having data on the resources for developing countries for various tools cannot be used as another way for accessing financing or for implementing international commitments. This shouldn't prejudice the issues such as a framework for distribution of the finances derived from various resources. We support the proposal to continue the discussions on the need for and the viability of modes for a specific instrument for biodiversity in consideration of the criteria that have been decided under Articles 20 and 21 of the Convention and other articles of interest for parties, particularly those for beneficiary countries. At the same time, we support the continuation of the actions for improving and for finding modalities for biodiversity. We will send in writing our specific comments on what's just been said. Thank you.
Thank you, Argentina. Next in line are Ethiopia, Philippines, Colombia, Turkey, Indonesia, Madagascar, Gabon. Ethiopia, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Happy birthday for every of us. Ethiopia supports statement made on item 4 by Zimbabwe on behalf of Africa. Ethiopia encourages and believes mobilizing resources from all available channels to halt biodiversity loss by 2030 as specified in KMGBF, and realizes the necessity of dedicating funds to the Global Biodiversity Fund. Ethiopia believes that Global Biodiversity Fund has to be reasonable and sufficiently substantial to address the financial gap of the developing countries. Cooperation and commitment from the developed country parties and other parties to do so to progressively increase funding are crucial in this regard. Regarding the dedicated Global Biodiversity Fund, co-financing should not be mandated as a prerequisite for funding, as it may disproportionately affect developing countries. Funding should equally prioritize the 3 objectives of the CBD along with its protocols. In conclusion, its accessibility should be clear and direct, ensuring the possibility of securing new, additional, predictable, adequate, timely financing and responsive to needs and priorities. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ethiopia. Philippines, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Philippines acknowledges with great appreciation the work of the Secretariat and the Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilization for the background document, SBI/4/5, for this agenda item, particularly on the strategy for resource mobilization. The Philippines further appreciates the work of the Secretariat in exploring the biodiversity finance landscape and recognizes the ongoing work by parties, indigenous peoples, local communities, women and youth, relevant stakeholders, organizations, and initiatives at all levels to strengthen, simplify, and reform existing instruments for biodiversity finance. We further recognize the importance of rights holders and the need to expand, include, and facilitate access to financial resources. On the draft recommendations of the Advisory Committee, the Philippines puts forward the following proposals and recommendations. First, in Annex 1, Revised Strategy for Resource Mobilization, Part 2, Enabling Actions, in relation to increasing domestic resource mobilization, the Philippines recommends identifying challenges and opportunities associated with implementing nature-related finance disclosure within financial institutions and regulators, and evaluate the impact of nature-related finance disclosure on promoting investments that support nature conservation and biodiversity. We further recommend the promotion of knowledge sharing and collaboration among stakeholders involved in nature-related finance disclosure initiatives and repurposing subsidies with unintended environmental footprints that are harmful for the biodiversity. Second, we agree and support the recommendation on increasing financial support for the biofin of the UNDP in order to contribute to increasing financial resources to implement the NBSAP and its Biodiversity Finance Plan. Third, in Part 3 on objectives and actions, it should identify which actor or organization or responsible party ought to do such actions, because COP needs to be informed which actions have actually generated how much funds and how much resources are mobilized. Fourth, we call on parties to support efforts that will ensure resources commensurate with the ambition of the GBF that are mobilized through 2030, including the interim commitment of $20 billion in international financing from developed countries and identification of harmful subsidies by 2025. Fifth, we further call on parties and partner institutions to collectively develop and implement finance solutions, such as payment of ecosystem services, green bonds, and other innovative conservation finance solutions with environmental and social safeguards, including the development of guidelines and sharing of good practices, while monitoring and assessing their impacts on biodiversity and human rights. Six, we support the proposal to leverage international finance, private finance, promote blended finance, implement strategies for mobilizing new and additional resources, and encourage the private sector to invest in biodiversity, including through biodiversity-friendly impact funds and other biodiversity-friendly instruments, such as well as philanthropic resources. And lastly, the Philippines further calls on parties to ensure that the operationalization and activities of the regional and sub-regional technical and scientific support centers will be funded from various sources, including the financial mechanism of the Convention, bilateral, multilateral, private sector, and philanthropic sources, as well as financial and in-kind contributions of the entities and organizations selected to host support centers. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and happy International Day for Biodiversity to all.
Thank you, Philippines. Next in line are Colombia, Turkey, Indonesia, Madagascar, Gabon, Costa Rica. Colombia, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the Secretariat for providing us with these documents, SBI 4.5 and CBD 4.6. We would like to begin by echoing our statement presented by Jamaica on behalf of GRULAC. It's important to note the crisis of biodiversity with the vulnerabilities of climate and the fiscal issues, which means an important challenge for us. The reality is clear. Since the pandemic of COVID-19, developing countries have major vulnerabilities. This has been exacerbated by interest rates going up and access to capital markets. We need to have a consistent, integrated, and accelerated approach which will allow us to be able to deal with our sustainable debts and guarantee us the necessary financing so we're able to respond to the biodiversity crisis. Colombia is working with Kenya, Germany, France, and the World Bank how we can deal with our debts so that we're able to advance in recommendations in order to materialize the necessary resources in order to increase the capacity for investment in the environment and the climate for those of middle income and developing countries without raising their level of debt. It's necessary that countries, banks, multilaterals work with financial development institutions and private players come to an agreement as to how we can improve our credit mechanisms and the bonds related to biodiversity. Colombia would like to make reference to the NBSAP and the initiative that was led by Germany and Colombia so as to reinforce the capacity for developing countries to accelerate the implementation of the NBSAPs. This alliance is working currently in setting up a matchmaking fund, which will be launched during the high-level meeting of COP16, in order to be able to improve access to financial resources, as well as technical resources and knowledge, in order to be able to improve our work in terms of biodiversity between the indices, the NBSAPs, the accelerated NBSAPs, has made it possible to have The speaker is speaking too fast. We hope that this support will be carried out over the next period between COP16. Given the documents that we're concerned with in SBI4, we would like to reiterate the leadership and support to the creation process and the implementation of the funds for the global framework of biodiversity under GEF as an alternative which is valid given the urgency of the triple crisis we're facing and the necessities of developing countries, and as a point for consensus between parties taking into consideration the elements that have been mentioned in the declaration made by Gluralak. Therefore, we also recognize the importance of analyzing and the effectiveness of GEF before we determine its reform. On the other hand, given the Fund for Biodiversity, we would like to see how its implementation could be over a considered period of time, particularly the key issues relating to Colombia, the implementation of the Global Fund for Biodiversity, as well as the direct access to the resources for indigenous peoples and farmers, as well as youth and women. Finally, given the challenge represented by the issue of mobilization of resources, we would like to thank the participants of the second meeting in person of the Accelerating Committee for Mobilization of Resources, which took place in March of this year in the Alexandrian Institute and led by Colombia, for its important reflections and deliberations on the need to adjust the mobilization strategies for financial resources given the issues relating to biodiversity, and to explore the panorama for financial resources over the long term for financial instruments for the CBD. Furthermore, to provide us a space to have all of the experience from Colombia in terms of institutions, indigenous peoples, and financial mechanisms quantifying their contributions under differentiated approach relating to gender and its impact on the various parts of the country. In terms of the draft recommendation, we will present in writing our considerations in writing and our suggestions for modification. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. The speaker was once again speaking too fast for proper interpretation.
Thank you, Colombia. I urge and request speakers, please, to speak slowly so that translators are comfortable with your speed. Thank you. Turkey, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Chair. The adoption of the GBF in Montreal was a landmark achievement, marking an important step forward in our global commitment to biodiversity conservation. However, while the framework sets ambitious goals and targets to safeguard our planet's biodiversity, it's clear that adequate resources are imperative for its proper application. In other words, we gather at a critical juncture for global biodiversity, tasked with advancing our collective efforts in resource mobilization to ensure the successful implementation of the framework. Turkey would like to extend its gratitude to the Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilization and the Technical Expert Group on Financial Reporting for their hard work and dedication. The Advisory Committee's exploration of a potential global biodiversity fund and its thorough assessment of the current finance landscape are important steps towards establishing a robust financial architecture for biodiversity. In this context, Turkey supports further in-depth discussions on the need for and feasibility of a dedicated global instrument for biodiversity finance and endorses establishing an open-ended working group to facilitate these discussions. As we laud these efforts, we must also acknowledge that the scale of our current resources is not yet sufficient. As many others have already stated, clear guidance and timely implementation are crucial if we are to meet our ambitious targets. The year 2025 is fast approaching. Our commitments must be matched by concrete actions and substantial financial support to bridge the gap between ambition and the reality. We wish you all a happy International Biodiversity Day. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Turkey. Indonesia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At the outset, Indonesia would like to support statements made by GRULAC and Africa, and in particular by Brazil and Democratic Republic of the Congo, which combined with Indonesia constitute three of the most biodiverse countries in the biodiversity world. On this agenda item 4A on resource mobilizations, Indonesia would like to convey 3 points. The first one, Indonesia appreciates the works made by the Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilization. Of course, we have some notes and concerns on the proposed draft COP decision on the matter, which among others, we think some proposed strategies are not related per se to financial flows. We will submit our draft proposed revision to the Secretariat. Second, Indonesia is strongly committed to implement the biodiversity plan, among others, by providing our domestic resource mobilizations to restore biodiversity loss. This is stated under Indonesia long-term development planning, which provides our vision of Golden Indonesia 2045, wherein biodiversity management achievements have been identified as one of the 45 national development indicators. And finally, and maybe this is our most important point, serious goals require serious mobilizations. Reversing biodiversity loss is expensive. Indonesia has significantly increased its biodiversity public spending, but it is still not enough. Finance gap is a global fact. As it has been mentioned by others, the gap between reality and the target 19 are too substantive. The scale is not enough. The responsibility and burden to restore biodiversity loss is and should not be the sole responsibilities of the host countries. This is clearly stated under Article 20 of our conventions. Hence, in this regard, we strongly call to developed countries to fulfill their agreed commitment under the Target 19 and under Article 20 and 21 under our convention. We thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Indonesia. Madagascar, you have the floor.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, we support the declaration made on behalf of Africa. We support the work that's been carried out by the advisory group for the updating of the strategy of financial mobilization. As a hotspot, we are pleased to note the adoption of the strategy, but without the implementation means in terms of resources, the implementation of this context will be handicapped, and we will be facing the same problems that we were facing at the time of the implementation of the Aichi targets. Without implementation resources, then the targets for 2030 will never be achieved. We believe that the implementation of a flexible mobilization resource program would be a solution in the long term for us to be able to combat the gaps in financing. We'd also like to make sure that the processes for access should be easy for member states. We congratulate the financial resources under GEV, which have allowed us to make progress in some activities. However, we're not convinced that this mechanism, this provisional mechanism, can make sure that we have the necessary financial resources which should be able to allow us to carry out our commitments under the framework. The statement made recently about the implementation and the operationalization in an effective manner for a dedicated fund for biodiversity under the Conference of the Parties in COP16 could make sure that we do not delay implementation. I thank you so much.
Thank you, Madagascar. Gabon, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Gabon supports the position for Africa presented by Zimbabwe. Mr. Chairman, Gabon would like to recall that the implementation framework for Kunming-Montreal was adopted in a context of biodiversity threatening the survival of millions of species and perturbing the lives of billions of people and our heritage for future generations. The adoption of the global framework was therefore seen as the hopeful way of mitigating the loss of biodiversity. We would like to therefore highlight the urgency of the implementation of specific activities to achieve the targets of the global framework, and we would therefore like to have as a basis for discussions the revised draft strategy for the finance mobilization for 2025 to 2030, which was presented under Annex 1 of this current document. And we insist on the importance of the making sure that there's $20 billion available by 2025. Gabon is concerned by the need to delay the issue of discussion of certain pertinent questions. And paragraph 6 of the draft recommendation of the Advisory Committee on the Mobilization of Resources for the subsidiary body on implementation, particularly on the review of the mobilization of resources, paragraph 13 in the same draft program on the Global Biodiversity Fund. We would also like to highlight the fact for the need for clarifications on the taking into account in a specific manner for the use of digital sequence information in that strategy. Gabon supports the need for synergies in the contribution of all sectors for the mobilization of financial resources. However, it is essential that this be done in a transparent manner. Mr. Chairman, Gabon is one of those countries in the Congo Basin and supports the declaration made by the DRC. In that regard, we will not come back on the important role of that part of the world and of Africa itself for the balance for the whole planet, because DRC has so clearly made that point. We are impatient to see the concretization of the framework with the resources as specified in order to be able to look at other questions relating to the urgency of biodiversity so that this no longer takes place. I thank you.
Thank you, Gabon. Costa Rica, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Costa Rica would like to thank the advisory group on the mobilization of resources and to the Secretariat for the document that's been presented. We believe that all of the parties for the convention should contribute in achieving the target of mobilization of resources for the Kunming-Montreal Global Framework. And however, we consider that those countries which are developing should make a national effort to identify the gaps at internal levels and to find ways to invest at national level in the various different aspects by indigenous peoples, etc. In general, Costa Rica believes it's necessary to strengthen the management of GEF because this is the financial mechanism which was established through the text of the Convention under Article 21. We believe that it's not the right moment to analyze the possibility of a further financial instrument, and instead we should concentrate on the implementation by 2030. In summary, we agree with those parties which have noted that this is not the right moment to analyze what was established in Annex 3 in terms of mobilization of resources, and we would prefer that this be taken out. Thank you.
Thank you, Costa Rica. Lebanon, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We welcome the draft recommendation on resource mobilization presented in document CBD/SBI/4/5 and the revised strategy for resource mobilization for the period 2025-2030 for the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, as contained in Annex 1 of the draft recommendation. We welcome the invitation addressed to the developed countries to provide additional support to the developing country parties, as well as the provision of financial resources from other different sources, such as international organizations and private sector. The mobilization of financial resources is crucial for developing countries to allow them to implement the 3 objectives of the Convention and to implement their national biodiversity strategies and action plans and their national targets that they are currently updating. This will help developing countries to implement the global biodiversity framework. Mr. Chair, all developing countries are currently revising and updating their national biodiversity strategies and action plans with financial support from the Global Environment Facility. And they are aligning their national targets with the global targets of the GBF. But once these MBSAPs will be finalized, the main challenge remains the allocation of necessary financial resources to enable those developing countries to implement their national actions set in their updated MBSAP in order to achieve their updated national targets. In Lebanon, we are facing many challenges during the current period due to severe economic crisis and severe other conflicts. And when our updated MBSAP will be issued, we will have many obstacles at financial level in implementing it, and thus in achieving the global target and realizing a successful implementation of the GBF, if necessary financial support and other needed resources will not be mobilized properly and provided to Lebanon in this regard. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Lebanon. Friends, we have completed the request from the parties. However, we have a few observers that we will give an opportunity in the afternoon session. I thank the interpreters for their hard work and coping up with the speed of the speakers. I thank them profusely for their hard work. Friends, as we all know, you heard in the morning announcement about this International Day for Biodiversity. We will have function now. If possible, wherever you sit, be there only and stretch your legs. And within a few minutes, once we move out of the podium, the function will start. So after that, lunch is there. So with this, I conclude this session and I adjourn the session now. Thank you very much for your cooperation. Thank you.
Colleagues. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. As the chair has said, you have a few moments to stretch your legs, but I encourage you to stay. Also because lunch is not served until the biodiversity event is finished, so there's some incentive for you to stay as well. We'll have our distinguished speakers coming here in just a moment. The other thing just to remind you is we've handed out pins for the biodiversity plan earlier this morning. So I trust most of you got them. I just have to let you know is that the numbers of this meeting are so grand that I only have a few spare ones. So A, don't lose it, and B, please don't ask for a second or third backup one. But we'll start in just a minute or two. Thanks very much, colleagues.